South Texas, on the U.S.-Mexican border. People have begun to disappear. Individuals, families, gone without a trace. All humanity is in danger. And this small Texas town sits at ground zero.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Ground Zero Texas, a full-motion video shooting game developed by Digital Pictures and published by Sony ImageSoft for the Sega CD back in 1993. We're going to look at that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 129. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean, Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Ground Zero, Texas.
Based on cell analysis, HQ has determined that these aliens must ingest a compatible life form in order to survive. Their constant cellular regeneration depends on it. Frankly, our best weapons can only stun these creeps. You gotta find a way to stop them. Now, there'll be an agent in each locale, and you'll get a wave once you get set. I'll be on the street as well, gathering what intelligence I can on the disappearances. Now, you're supposedly the best we've got. And we're counting on you to watch our backs and be there in the event that something goes wrong. And there's one other thing. You're the last chance we have. We don't get this situation contained. HQ has a B-2 in the air with a TAC nuke. They're ready to drop it.
Ground Zero Texas is a full-motion video shooting game developed by Digital Pictures and published by Sony ImageSoft for the Sega CD in 1993. Before we can talk about Ground Zero Texas, we have to address the fact that we have now entered tradition territory, in that every year around this time, we have talked about a different full-motion video title from Digital Pictures. 2 years ago, we discussed one of their first two games, Sewer Shark, and just last year, we discussed Night Trap, which released at the same time as Sewer Shark and was one of the more controversial titles to come out in the early 90s. Both of those titles achieved golden oldie status, a far cry from what most of the internet would have you believe, as full-motion video titles, don't you know, are supposed to be awful. From a personal perspective, most of you know that I'm a huge proponent of FMV in gaming, and I believe it represents a pivotal moment in the evolution of video game narratives. While I'd never argue that the majority of FMV titles are true quality entertainment, the use of real actors and pre-recorded video in games showed that the computer and video game market was interested in moving beyond the gameplay-driven roots of the industry, and would instead begin placing greater emphasis on storylines and plot development. It was actually an indication that the games industry was maturing and trying to reach an even broader audience, which at the end of the day was beneficial to all involved. I mention all of this to say that for longtime listeners, part of our upcoming discussion is going to be familiar, as the origins of the story behind Ground Zero Texas's creation mirror that of both Night Trap and Sewer Shark, and the genesis of full-motion video as a genre in gaming shares one singular origin story. But, in order to ensure that each episode of our podcast can stand alone, we need to repeat a little bit of history along the way. So with that said, let's talk a bit about the origins of full-motion video in gaming. The first full-motion video games were released in arcades in the early 80s as a means of playing a form of animated movie on arcade hardware, and the player would often be prompted to take some sort of action that would affect how that video would play out, or to which scene the video would jump to. In this way, full-motion video games in arcades were effectively a string of quick-time events, or QTEs, with the player given little choice as to how the story played out, short of being able to avoid death. You might be wondering what kind of technology was used to house the arcade machine's video, as you may recognize that CD-ROM technology wasn't really on anyone's mind until the late 80s, and wasn't really utilized for full-motion video until the CD-ROM craze of the 90s. Similarly, the memory chips used in most consoles and arcades at the time just didn't have enough capacity to store the amount of data required by full-motion video content. So instead, arcade manufacturers turned to another video disc standard of the time, the high-quality Laserdisc format. I say high quality because for the early 80s, Laserdisc was pretty much the best possible format for both audio and video production, and Laserdisc players of the time were extremely expensive and weren't nearly as pervasive as the videocassette recorders, or VCRs, that almost every household had at least one of. Laserdisc offered a number of benefits over the VCR format, one being the quality of video, as the format had a video resolution consisting of 425 horizontal lines in comparison to videocassette's relatively paltry 240 horizontal display lines. But beyond the quality offered by the video format, the main reason Laserdiscs were used in early full-motion video arcade titles was because it allowed for random seeks and jumps from scene to scene, while VCRs, for those who might be unaware, were effectively linear devices. Meaning, if you wanted to skip past a certain scene in a movie, you couldn't just click next, you had to hit fast forward, and wait while the tape advanced rapidly through whatever scene was playing. Using a linear format for games that allow for various user inputs wouldn't really work to provide a positive experience for players. And the reason for that comes down to player choice. To illustrate why this is, let's take a look at one of the early Laserdisc arcade games, Dragon's Lair, and how the actions in that game play out. We're going to discuss Dragon's Lair in only the simplest terms here, purely as an illustration of early FMV gaming. If you're interested in learning more about Dragon's Lair specifically, definitely check out our episode that we did previously, which focused entirely on Dragon's Lair itself. Anyway, in Dragon's Lair, you play a knight named Dirk the Daring, who is on a quest to save a princess named Daphne from certain doom. In order to progress through the game and save the princess, you have to traverse a series of different scenes and dangerous situations, all playing out in a very cartoon-like animated video. And the way it works is, at various points in the video, you'll be presented with an opportunity to take one of several options. As in the original iteration of the arcade game, there were no button prompts on the screen to help guide your inputs. In fact, there wasn't even any indication of when you were supposed to take an action. Instead, you'd simply observe the video and hit one of 4 directional inputs on your joystick or swing your sword whenever you thought the scene being played might warrant some degree of interaction. Assuming you chose correctly, the Laserdisc player would automatically jump to the location on the disc that corresponded to a successful choice. If you chose the wrong action, the Laserdisc player would similarly jump to the location on the disc that corresponded to that incorrect choice, which might make the game play out down a different path, or potentially lead to your death, which, by the way, was the case more often than not. Because of the need to jump from scene to scene quickly and with as little delay as possible, using Laserdiscs for the game makes perfect sense, and the nearly instantaneous video playback, regardless of your choices, ended up creating what felt like a personalized cartoon driven entirely by your own actions, whether right or wrong. If, however, videocassettes were used instead of Laserdiscs, then the act of jumping from scene to scene wouldn't really exist due to the linearity of the format. If the player were to take the action that doesn't immediately follow the currently playing scene, then he or she would have to wait for the videocassette to fast forward or rewind before the next scene would begin to play. This simply wouldn't be all that great to experience as a player. Can you imagine playing a game that was effectively a series of 5 to 10 second gameplay snippets, followed by 20 seconds or more worth of load time? That would be absolutely awful, and if that's what FMV games would have had to rely on, there's no doubt they would have died before they ever attained any degree of popularity. So, QuickTime event-driven titles like Dragon's Lair were one type of full-motion video game prevalent in early arcade machines. But there were other ways full-motion video was being used at the time, most notably as background scenery for games that were themselves effectively graphical overlays over the scenery. As a hypothetical example, let's say you're making a Star Wars game, and you want to recreate the Death Star run made famous in the first Star Wars film, which, by the way, is Episode 4. An arcade machine of the time wouldn't really have the power to create 3-dimensional graphics, texture maps, anti-aliasing, and all of the other graphical bells and whistles to make you feel like you're really in an X-Wing attacking a Death Star. But it could have the ability to play back a video of the Death Star run, while at the same time adding graphics on top of the video depicting TIE fighters, lasers, and other targets that you would position your crosshair over and shoot, causing those targets to explode. Now, the video in the scene would never change, short of potentially jumping from one scene to another, similar to how QuickTime event-driven games work. But the graphics being overlaid on the scene can change, and you can potentially introduce more interesting controls, like targeting systems, than simply pressing a direction or action button and having a scene play out in front of you. In this way, you can maintain the feeling of realism and graphical fidelity prevalent with full-motion video, while at the same time allowing for more varied gameplay elements that provide deeper levels of immersion for the player. It's probably fairly obvious, but to be clear, if you wanted to play FMV games in the 80s, you pretty much had to do so at the arcades, as those were the only machines that had the power and equipment necessary to deliver a worthwhile FMV gaming experience. But that doesn't mean there weren't attempts to bring the technology into the home, with one of the earliest examples being a failed videocassette gaming experiment called the Control Vision Console, otherwise known as Project Nemo. Recall our discussion from a little bit ago related to how videocassettes are not a good medium for interactive experiences, due primarily to the fact that the videocassette is a linear format. But what if you could have a linear experience while still allowing scenes to change immediately, not through random jumping to different sections of a disc, but by allowing one of multiple video streams to be played at any one time, while other video streams played concurrently but out of the player's sight? This, at a high level, is exactly what the Control Vision console attempted to do. The Control Vision was a home console that was being developed by Hasbro, Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari, and a number of other game industry visionaries, including a man named Tom Zito back in 1985. It was designed to utilize videocassettes as its main format, and it was, by extension, designed to utilize full-motion video across all of its games. More specifically, the goal was to use video shot just like a movie, with real actors, but allow players to interact with the video and therefore cause each game to play out differently based on your input. The way that the team went about doing this is, from my perspective, nothing short of ingenious. But to understand the technology behind the console, we have to dive pretty deep into VHS cassettes and the way cathode ray tube or CRT televisions process data. When an image is displayed on a CRT television, it's actually not the full image that you see at any given time, but half an image. Take, for example, a CRT with 480 lines of horizontal resolution. Every 1/60th of a second, the electron gun inside the television paints 240 lines to the television screen, and the next 1/60th of a second, the remaining 240 lines are painted to the screen. This alternating pattern continues, and because it's so fast, the human eye can't really perceive the difference in horizontal lines being created, which for reference means that most televisions were displaying at 60 frames per second. The Control Vision team understood this limitation and wondered, what happened if we controlled playback such that we used two discrete video streams, one stored in the first 240 lines printed to the television, the next stored in the remaining 240 lines, but only displayed one set of lines to the end user at any given time? Doing so would allow for the illusion of multi-track playback, even in a linear-based system like videocassettes. In this example, two discrete video streams can be played back at the exact same time, with the console determining which set of 240 lines would actually be displayed to the player. But if you manipulate the frame rate, it becomes possible to decompose those two video streams into even more concurrent streams of video. So, while you might be able to store two concurrent streams of video at 60 frames per second, you could store four concurrent streams at 30 frames per second. This, in turn, enabled immediate scene switching using a medium that would otherwise require sequential fast-forwarding or rewinding. Put another way, when the player took an action that would change the scene of the game, the console would switch to a different set of lines, representing an individual video stream, and like magic, a new scene would begin playing on the screen. There was no need to fast forward or seek out the appropriate scene, because all of the various scenes available to the player were running concurrently with one another. So, the actual story playing out was pretty much entirely linear, as you would expect given the videocassette format. But players could choose to focus on different scenes at any given time, which embedded a degree of interactivity that would otherwise have been impossible on analog videocassettes. While the Control Vision console was an attempt to take that innovative videocassette playback technology and apply it to a gaming use case, the actual technology originated outside of the game industry entirely, having been created by an engineer who had a chance encounter with Tom Zito and ended up demonstrating the concept to him. Zito loved the idea, and the people he was working with thought it had merit, so they decided to try to turn it into a gaming-based proof of concept. The only question was, well, what would that proof of concept really be focused on? We've already discussed a couple of different forms of full-motion video games that had been prevalent in arcades of the time, and now, Zito and the team had to figure out what the best demonstration of their new VHS-based system would be. And here, inspiration would come from a somewhat unlikely place, at least as it relates to video games: the world of stage plays. While many video game experiences resulted from licensed movies and television shows, you don't really hear about plays driving a ton of inspiration in the video game space. But for the team behind the ControlVision console, things would be different, as they had an opportunity to see a 1981 play named Tamara several times in 1985, and they were immediately struck by a flash of inspiration. Tamara was a play that can best be described as experimental, and is certainly a unique production in the theater industry. For those who may not have had the opportunity to see a play in a theater, a traditional play involves a single stage upon which actors perform, in real time, various scenes over a series of acts, with the stage providing the focal point that the audience is meant to direct their attention towards. Occasionally, plays deviate from that formula by having actors perform in the audience, but even in those instances, there's typically one singular story and scene that's playing out. Tamara was an entirely different kind of experience, in that rather than having a single scene play out at a time, in Tamara, 13 different stories would play out at the same time, and it was up to the audience to determine which story each individual wanted to pay attention to, and which ones they wanted to ignore. That might sound strange, or perhaps overwhelming, until you realize that the way this play is typically performed is by using an actual house, where different actors inhabit different rooms of the house, and audience members are invited to walk around each of the rooms, interacting with the actors and sometimes even becoming part of the play themselves. The thing is, though, because there were multiple parallel stories taking place at a single time, it would be impossible to witness everything going on in the play in one sitting. So theatergoers would often attend the play multiple times, observing different rooms and stories each time, in an effort to fully understand the true meaning and overarching story of the play's narrative. Which is why, when members of the ControlVision team had an opportunity to see the play in 1985, they were immediately intrigued, and would return to watch the play several times over the course of a single weekend, each time learning more about the underlying story and characters. And it was this parallel story kind of structure that the team believed would be a perfect example of their ControlVision hardware, which is why shortly after viewing that play, they created the interactive demo known as Scene of the Crime, as a means of showing exactly what the technology could do. Scene of the Crime would offer players the ability to interact with multiple camera feeds, switching between them at will, allowing players to dive deeper into certain aspects of the story while other parts continue to play out along a linear timeline. If that sounds confusing, think about it like this. When you hit play on the game, 4 distinct video tracks begin playing at once, each on a different video stream embedded in the videocassette. As you, the player, switch between the various feeds, different video tracks, which are really just frame offsets of sorts, are selected for display, effectively hiding the other concurrently running tracks. To you, it seems like the camera feeds are just seamlessly jumping from one to another. But from a technology perspective, all it involved was displaying the appropriate combination of frame and 240 lines on the screen, and hiding the other streams as appropriate. This technology, while awesome sounding in theory, had some severe issues in practice. Most notably, in order to maintain the illusion of continuity across all disparate video streams, every individual track had to be perfectly synchronized, which introduced complexity into both the recording and editing process, as well as the final act of splicing all of the various video tracks together into a series of concurrently running streams. Despite those issues, though, the ControlVision team demonstrated the system, and their prototype Scene of the Crime, to toy manufacturer Hasbro in late 1986, a meeting which earned the team rave reviews and a good chunk of funding to begin developing full-fledged titles for the system. With money in hand, Zito and the rest of the team sat down to begin brainstorming what games they would create as the first experiences for the ControlVision console. And here, because the system was intended to be a video-driven console, it only made sense to attempt to attract current film distributors as potential partners, with an initial goal of creating an interactive movie based on the very popular A Nightmare on Elm Street film series, which involves a demonic presence, Freddy Krueger, haunting the dreams of various teens living on the titular residential street. This sounded like a perfect application of the ControlVision technology, so Zito and the rest of the team began negotiating with film production company New Line Cinema, in the hopes of acquiring the Elm Street license. Unfortunately, those negotiations would eventually fall through, leaving Zito and the team without a license to use for their new game. So they decided to do the next best thing, which was to create an entirely original story focused on an eccentric billionaire who kept his fortune stored in his grand mansion, protected by a series of state-of-the-art traps and security systems to prevent any theft from potentially occurring. One weekend, the billionaire's daughter and several of her friends decide to stay overnight at the house, which of course is also the weekend that a team of highly skilled ninja burglars decide to rob the billionaire's home. With only you as the player standing between those ninja thieves, a group of teenage girls, and billions of dollars, your job is to use surveillance cameras positioned around the house to observe each room and, at appropriate times, trigger the installed traps to capture the ninja robbers and save both the teenage slumber party goers as well as the billionaire's vast fortune. That concept would evolve a bit from this original idea, eventually morphing from protecting a teenage slumber party from ninja burglars to protecting a teenage slumber party from vampiric creatures known as augurs, though as that vampire idea materialized, the team faced an unexpected challenge. Hasbro, who like I said was the primary investor behind the game and the Control Vision console itself, had a policy in place that any filmed footage could not feature what they called reproducible violence. Meaning, if the footage showed something that someone could conceivably do in the real world, it could not be used for the game. Now, I'm not sure how up to speed everyone is on vampire practices, but typically, vampires drain the blood from their victims via a bite on the neck, which incidentally would fit into Hasbro's definition of reproducible violence. So, the team needed to figure out how to use vampires, but not use their defining characteristic, which resulted in the augurs becoming slow-moving creatures who, rather than biting and sucking the blood from a victim's neck, would instead use an odd contraption that effectively served the same function. But because that contraption did not exist in the real world, it was totally safe to use in the game. Definitely an interesting interpretation of Hasbro's rules. Regardless, the final concept for the game was agreed upon, and with that, production on the title that would eventually be known as Night Trap began in earnest. Over a period of 6 months, Night Trap would be filmed, edited, and programmed, with most of the time spent on actually splicing together all of the filmed footage into a usable format. Filming the footage for the game took around 16 days to complete, and would notably include actress Dana Plato in a starring role, who at the time was best known for her role in the family sitcom Different Strokes. Plato at the time was experiencing a fall from grace, as she was unfortunately stuck in the throes of addiction, which ended up manifesting itself in being difficult to work with while on set. Luckily, that didn't impact the filming schedule, because Plato ultimately wasn't in that many scenes directly. The augurs, however, despite being nameless masked creatures, were prevalent throughout the game, and those characters would be played by a series of stunt people who, in an attempt to avoid real injury, developed an interesting walking style that was kind of a side-to-side, slightly hunched shamble, which ostensibly was done to make it so that they'd always be ready to fall into a trap. Now, I found that particularly interesting, because my assumption was that they'd receive some sort of cue when a trap was about to be activated, but it sounds like maybe that didn't happen? If so, that's kinda awesome, and adds a whole new dimension to the footage that accompanies you trapping an augur in the game. Anyway, eventually all of the principal photography would be completed, which meant it was now time to splice all of that footage together into a game, which proved to be challenging, as at any given time, 4 different video streams and stories were playing at the same time, all of which had to be synchronized in order to create the illusion of a free-flowing film. Interestingly, the final game would end up featuring 8 rooms, though only those previously mentioned 4 video streams would play at any point, meaning that 4 rooms would always be static, while 4 rooms would always have action. The static and action-driven rooms would change as the game played out, but that 4 and 4 rule would be maintained throughout the experience. Once all of that programming and video splicing magic was finished, preparations would begin on releasing Night Trap for the Control Vision console, right around the same time that sister title Sewer Shark was also being readied for release. The actual creation of Sewer Shark, at least as far as video filming was concerned, happened in 1987, and unlike Night Trap, would be a much quicker overall production. Over a period of a single month, Zito stood up a team of actors and film industry veterans to record the movie sequences that would actually be used in the game. The most well-known Hollywood type involved in that production was a man named John Dykstra, who ended up directing the video portions of the experience. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he's a 3-time Oscar-winning visual effects genius, was one of the first employees at Industrial Lights and Magic, which is pretty much the premier visual effects studio in Hollywood, and was also the person responsible for many of the special effects in the very first Star Wars film. He was kind of a big deal. Anyway, 1 month and $3 million later, Sewer Shark Principal Photography had wrapped, and work on splicing all of that video together and creating an actual game around those video sequences took the majority of the team's attention. Eventually, both Sewer Shark and Night Trap would be ready to release to the market, the first in what Tom Zito and the team hoped would be a string of successful full-motion video titles for the ControlVision home console. Everything was pretty much ready to go, and then Hasbro pulled the plug on the console right before its launch in 1989, a result of the hardware being too expensive to produce and sell, and the technology being just a bit too tricky to work with. So, despite 2 games being pretty much ready to ship, all work would stop once the console launch was cancelled, and both Night Trap and Sewer Shark would end up stuck in limbo. With no alternative at the time, Tom Zito purchased the rights to both games and stored everything in a Rhode Island warehouse, in the hopes that he would be able to revisit them again in the future. We'll now fast forward to 1991, where a relatively new format was beginning to take the computing and video game industry by storm. That format, of course, was the CD-ROM, a massive jump in storage technology that allowed for previously unheard of amounts of data to be stored on a single disk, 650 megabytes to be precise. With the proliferation of the CD-ROM and the adoption of the technology by console giant Sega for use with their forthcoming add-on system, the Sega CD, Tom Zito saw an opportunity. In 1991, he, along with several other members of the failed ControlVision team, decided to form a new company called Digital Pictures, whose focus was going to be creating full-motion video experiences for CD-ROM technology. CD-ROMs allowed for many of the same benefits as the Laserdisc technology we previously discussed, in that drives could skip to pretty much any part of the disc instantaneously, which effectively served as a more cost-effective mechanism for bringing FMV titles into the home. As Digital Pictures began considering what games to make first, the team recalled that not only had Tom Zito purchased the rights to both Night Trap and Sewer Shark, but he also had all of the original film and game assets locked away in a Rhode Island warehouse. The team therefore decided that they would focus on those titles first, and work on Night Trap and Sewer Shark resumed, years after the games themselves had originally been created. The good news for Zito and the team was that most of the time-consuming work was already complete. All they needed to do was figure out how to effectively port the titles from the ControlVision to the Sega CD. Now, we have talked before about how Laserdiscs and CDs allow for skipping to different areas of the disc with little, if any, perceptible lag to the player. In reality, that's not entirely accurate. Most Laserdisc titles did in fact have a very short pause when jumping from scene to scene, and even though CD-ROMs were capable of immediate jumps, the speed of CD-ROM drives at the time, which was 150 kilobytes per second, otherwise known as single-speed drives, wasn't conducive to playing full-motion video sequences with any level of fidelity or smoothness. In order to make the experience better for the player, the Digital Pictures team basically recreated the ControlVision technology, albeit on a CD-ROM disc. Meaning, for Night Trap and Sewer Shark, multiple streams of video were being read from a single data stream, which meant that as video sequences shifted from one scene to the next, there was literally zero pause in the action. It all felt like a single integrated video. To accomplish that feat, the team had to create their own video format and codec, because the technology for creating this kind of fast-paced, fully integrated video stream just did not exist at the time. This codec would be improved throughout the years, and would be utilized in a number of Digital Pictures' future FMV titles. As it relates to Night Trap and Sewer Shark, the end result was that to the player, everything was entirely seamless, and they could literally choose to view any room at any time and see a continuous, fully synchronized video stream. Tom Zito's vision of having a true interactive movie where players control the action was about to come true. Both Night Trap and Sewer Shark would end up being launch day titles for the Sega CD in North America, hitting the market on October 15, 1992, both representing the first instances of a home console title using full-motion video as the primary mechanic in a game. That's right, Night Trap, Sewer Shark, and Digital Pictures were trailblazers in the video game industry. There was just one problem. Right around the time that Night Trap was released, the United States and other areas of the world were going through a period of self-reflection as it related to the rapidly developing and maturing video game industry. The video games of the 80s, which were primarily pixel-styled affairs designed to cater to younger players, were rapidly being replaced by edgier titles that, rather than depicting cute scenes to admire, were instead throwing showers of blood at players, as most prominently seen in titles like Doom and Mortal Kombat. Night Trap, however, posed a different threat. While the on-screen violence was decidedly tamer than other gorier titles, Night Trap was a full-motion video game, which for many senators in the US government represented something that was just a bit too real, especially considering the game's content, which included young women clothed in slightly revealing lingerie and, at one point, a bra. And those young women were being attacked by vampiric creatures. Obviously, something had to be done to save the youth of the world. So, a series of Senate hearings were held, where Night Trap and its more mature cousins would effectively stand trial, while a number of government officials, video game luminaries, and others would discuss the impact of such titles on children, whom many believed were still the primary audience for video games. For anyone who lived through this period of history, you likely recognize that the whole situation was blown out of proportion, and oftentimes, different officials would demonstrate their own ignorance by explaining the concept of Night Trap as being what amounted to a vampire simulator. They claimed that the purpose of Night Trap was for you, the player, to attack and abduct women. This obviously wasn't true at all, as your real purpose in Night Trap is to save those young women from their would-be attackers. Regardless, the damage was done, and Night Trap gained a level of infamy that very few games in history can claim. The end result of all of this controversy was the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or ESRB, in 1994, which is the United States organization responsible for rating games based on their content in an effort to categorize titles as either being suitable for the entire population or restricted to more mature gamers. While the ESRB is an American organization, other similar groups would pop up around the world, driven largely by the same concerns as were raised by the United States government. Despite that controversy, or perhaps because of that controversy, sales for the game ended up increasing, and Night Trap would go on to sell 400,000 copies in the years following its release, which is pretty impressive considering major toy retailers like Toys R Us refused to sell the title in their stores. At the same time, the less controversial Sewer Shark, Night Trap's sister title, would end up performing even better on the market, as it became the pack-in title for the Sega CD, and in the process went on to sell over 750,000 copies itself. For Digital Pictures and Tom Zito, their first FMV titles were unmitigated successes. And with those successes, the team at Digital Pictures would be encouraged to create even more full-motion video titles, as they now had some additional working capital, and given the demand for both Night Trap and Sewer Shark, the team believed FMV games were truly going to be the future of entertainment. So, Digital Pictures set out to begin creating the next generation of FMV titles, and by extension, the first ones to be created as brand new experiences outside of the failed Control Vision experiment. This is what would eventually result in the creation of a series of make-your-own music video experiences featuring bands like INXS, Crisscross, and Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch, boxing-themed sports title Prize Fighter, and several shooting gallery kinds of games, like Zombie Thriller Corpse Killer, and, most pertinent to our discussion today, Ground Zero Texas. Using the profits made from both Sewer Shark and Night Trap, Digital Pictures would invest $3 million into Ground Zero Texas's production, hiring a team full of Hollywood talent, both from an acting perspective, as well as for those individuals behind the camera, as Digital Pictures really wanted their second generation of FMV titles to be a step beyond what they had worked on previously. While the potential jump in quality was something they truly believed in, this also came with an added and unforeseen side effect. In order to hire true Hollywood crews and actors and create a real Hollywood production, you have to negotiate with and strike deals with a number of different organizations that represent the different creative types that might be working on a film, including such groups as the Directors Guild, Screen Actors Guild, and Writers Guild. Most FMV titles up to this point had used minimal, if any, true Hollywood talent. Maybe you'd have a well-known director, as was the case with Sewer Shark, or maybe you'd have a solid B-list actor, as was the case with Night Trap. But no game studio had ever attempted to marry all aspects of a game's production with the production value of a Hollywood film. For Ground Zero Texas, Digital Pictures intended to do just that, and in the process would become the very first video game to ever utilize this type of full Hollywood production. With expectations sky high for the production, attention turned to the game's story, which would end up being inspired by 50s pulp science fiction films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Invaders from Mars. While Digital Pictures co-founder Ken Melville would pen the first draft of the game's script, it would eventually get the full rewrite treatment, with several Hollywood screenwriters taking turns scrubbing the script and making it more film-centric, which would be married with a professional film production schedule complete with custom sets, backlots, and on-location shooting to bring the game's story to life. Once filming for all of the video sequences was complete, the team then had to figure out how to convert that film into a format that the Sega CD could process. The good news was that the team had done this before with both Night Trap and Sewer Shark, using a custom video compression and playback codec that took raw footage and converted it into a Sega CD usable video stream. The bad news, as would be the case with every FMV game released on the Sega CD, was that video was restricted to only showing 64 colors at a time with a relatively low resolution, driven by the technical limitations of both the Sega CD's graphics subsystem as well as the speed of the console's CD-ROM drive, which was limited to 150 kilobytes per second. To put that into perspective, a standard 4K video stream today uses approximately 25 megabits per second, which is the equivalent of 3,125 kilobytes. If a 4K video was going to be played on the Sega CD's CD-ROM drive, it would take nearly 21 seconds to load 1 second of video. So obviously, the lower the resolution and size of the video, the quicker and more smoothly the video could stream. It was a concession, certainly, but given the technology available at the time, it was a required compromise. Despite that known technical limitation, the team still felt a bit of a sting when they had to convert their high-quality Hollywood-filmed video into a lower-resolution format playable on a Sega CD. Ken Melville, one of Digital Pictures' co-founders and the original writer of the game's script, was quoted as saying, "All our video had to be tortured, kicking and screaming into the most horrifying, blurry, reduced color palette mess imaginable in the Sega CD. I shudder to think about it." It certainly sounds like the team's aspirations were higher than what Sega's console could support, but regardless, that was life as a Sega CD developer in the early 90s, and technically, Digital Pictures was well aware of the Sega CD's limitations given their prior titles. I suppose this one stung more than the others given the full-scale Hollywood treatment they had given to the game, which I can certainly appreciate. Eventually, all of the development, film, and technical work would complete on the game, and Ground Zero Texas would release on the market in November of 1993. Upon its release, critics would rate the title pretty highly, with some reviewers declaring the video quality to be breathtaking, and others praising the game's storyline and music. Some publications, like Electronics Gaming Monthly, even awarded Ground Zero Texas the coveted title of Best Sega CD Game of the Year, while others recognized that if you were looking for an FMV title on Sega's CD-based console, Ground Zero Texas was pretty much the one to beat. It would also sell really well too, becoming the best-selling Sega CD game in the UK for 4 months straight in early 1994. Proof that Digital Pictures was still onto something with their whole FMV-based game strategy. Not everyone was so kind, however, as some critics believed the controls to be poor, the acting to be ham-fisted, and the dialogue to be unnatural. For the most part, though, reviewers around the time Ground Zero Texas was released enjoyed the title. Retrospective analysis in later years would be much less kind, as the internet has judged most FMV titles to be poor representations of interactive experiences. And since Ground Zero Texas is certainly an FMV title, it often gets lumped in with other games as part of the FMV fad that many people nowadays publicly deride. Despite that everlasting critique of FMV titles, and the fact that FMV as a gaming technology fell out of favor in the later 90s, which in turn effectively drove Digital Pictures out of business, that didn't stop Ground Zero Texas from being remastered and re-released on modern systems in 2021 by Screaming Villains, the same company responsible for several other Sega CD FMV remasters, like Night Trap, Double Switch, and Corpse Killer. While I haven't yet played the remastered edition of Ground Zero Texas, I am truly glad it exists, as anything that can be done to keep FMV gaming alive is, from my perspective, a good thing. With Ground Zero Texas, you have a title that was one of the first second-generation FMV experiences from Digital Pictures, a true Hollywood-produced interactive film that strived to evolve the technology, filming process, and interactive film genre itself to greater heights than it had ever seen. Well, I'll let you know my own opinion of the title in just a little bit. Suffice it to say that the Digital Pictures of the early 90s was an impressive game development studio, and was one that really wanted to push the boundaries of technology, with Ground Zero Texas being an early attempt at raising the bar for what it meant to be an interactive film. For fans of FMV and games like me, Digital Pictures is likely one of those companies that you simply love, and I have no doubt we will continue to cover them in the future. While it might not be for everyone, I still encourage you all to keep an open mind when looking at these earlier FMV experiences, and don't just believe the internet and its overly negative belief that FMV and gaming should have never existed. Instead, I encourage you to seek out and try FMV gaming experiences yourself, and form your own opinions. Who knows, you might just end up finding a new favorite game. And that act of discovery, above everything else, is something that is definitely worth celebrating.
Can you see me? Everything looks good from here. All right, now 4 battle cams have been re-energized and outfitted with alien weapons.
All the aliens are on the run.
Can SATCOM tell us where they're headed?
I don't know, I'm breaking up, I'm checking. SATCOM! SATCOM, get in here! Give us... Oh!
I was tracking the ones that were stunned. Follow them to the edge of town. That's when I saw the others.
What others?
We gotta get out of here, man! Those are stormtroopers! Right over our heads!
You've got the firepower! Use it!
We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Ground Zero Texas today versus when it was released over 30 years ago. At its core, Ground Zero Texas is a shooting gallery kind of experience, where throughout the game you'll encounter a number of different scenes, oftentimes with a mix of bad guys to shoot and good guys to leave alone. As was typical with most FMV-based shooting games like Mad Dog McCree and the rest of the American Laser Games discography, each scene in the game is randomized, in that you never know where an enemy, civilian, or anything else is going to show up, and it is up to you to be quick enough on the trigger, but observant and patient enough in your aim to tell friend from foe and only attack your enemies, lest you end up with a nasty game over due to killing too many non-hostile characters. As with most shooting gallery styled games, you have a set number of scenes you'll have to progress through before you can beat the game, and you have a set number of lives, so to speak, that you can lose before the game ends, giving you a degree of resiliency should you take too much damage from enemy forces. Oftentimes with FMV shooting games, the story progresses linearly from one plot point to the next, with various cutscenes interspersed with shooting segments to eventually create a fully stitched together interactive movie when all is said and done. And for the most part, Ground Zero Texas follows this formula pretty faithfully, though interestingly, as with many of Digital Pictures' titles, they wanted to go a bit beyond the norm to create games that were somewhat deeper than other forms of interactive FMV titles. So let's talk about the general structure of Ground Zero Texas, and how that structure creates a unique gameplay experience that, for better and for worse, feels different than many FMV shooting gallery-styled games of the time. Ground Zero Texas is split up into 4 different levels, representing progress through the overall story, and within each of those levels, you'll have a set of scenes to interact with and shoot all sorts of bad guys. Unlike games like Mad Dog McCree, whose individual scenes play out one after another, Ground Zero Texas takes a page from Night Trap's book, presenting players with 4 different weapon turrets with attached video cameras that can be switched between depending on where a set of enemies may be attacking. The act of switching from one video feed to the next is accomplished by holding the A button on your Genesis controller and pressing a direction on your control pad corresponding to the different camera locations, which are depicted on your screen in a cross-shaped arrangement. Each of those video feeds will direct you to a different scene in the game, and each of those scenes may have one of several different things happening at any point in time. You may have a static image, which means nothing's happening at that particular location. Or you might have a cutscene playing out, which may or may not require interaction at some point for you to intervene and shoot a bad guy. Or, most commonly, you'll have a single static background presented to you which will, over time, be populated by a number of enemies flooding the screen, whether running from one side of the scene to the other, popping up from behind barriers and other obstacles, appearing out of doorways, or any number of other entrances that may or may not catch you off guard. At the same time, civilians will randomly appear as well, and those good guys you really don't want to shoot, as after hitting too many of them, which I think is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 in an entire playthrough, the game will end entirely, regardless of how accurately you may be dealing with enemy forces. This ultimately would become a major frustration of mine, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Anyway, as you're dealing with the various bad guys in a scene, and by dealing with, I mean shooting them with your controller's C button and an unlimited supply of ammunition, you may, if you're not fast enough, take some damage. And here, the game offers a unique take on the concept of lives, hit points, and survival in an FMV shooting game. Rather than simply take one hit and become incapacitated, in Ground Zero Texas, each of the camera and weapon turrets you control have a set amount of shielding representing the amount of shots they can take before they become destroyed. In what I thought was a cool mechanic, the more damage an individual turret takes, the worse the video feed becomes, eventually starting to blink in and out of color mode, followed by some light image corruption, until finally it becomes a broken mess of a screen where you can detect movement, but can't really see whether that movement is caused from enemies or civilians, making choosing your shots a mostly random luck-based decision. When operating in a mostly undamaged capacity though, your turret has a feature that will highlight any enemies with a box, effectively representing the hitbox for any enemy that might be on the screen. Civilians will not show any sort of hitbox, which means that being able to detect that hitbox quickly and accurately will be a huge benefit as you continue to play the game, lest you inadvertently shoot some good guys and lose the game. The tricky part is that as your turret and camera take damage, one of the first features to become broken is that targeting hitbox, meaning once the turret takes a certain amount of damage, it'll be entirely up to your own observational skills to determine whether a person on the screen needs to be shot or whether they should be left alone. This definitely impacts the difficulty of the experience, at least until you get used to identifying enemies versus civilians, though I will admit, even after I had played the game for several hours, I'd occasionally make a mistake and end up losing the game. If all you had to worry about was staying at one scene and shooting bad guys without shooting good guys, that'd be one thing. But, like we mentioned earlier, Ground Zero Texas features 4 different scenes that can be switched between as needed, and each scene will randomly have something happening, or not happening at any given point in time. And just like Night Trap, there might be 2 or more conflicting scenes where things are happening, and it'll be up to you to figure out which ones to pay attention to, and which ones to ignore. At certain points in the story, you may have a couple of different shooting gallery scenes playing out at the same time, and as you might surmise, it is impossible for you to be in 2 places at once, which means at least one of your turrets will be taking damage without you being there to protect it. Luckily, each turret is also equipped with a special metallic shield grate that you can utilize to cover the turret and camera and protect it from taking damage, which means you can switch to a scene, enable the metallic shield by pressing your controller's B button, and then switch to a different scene, letting that metal grate soak up damage while you're otherwise dealing with threats elsewhere. The issue is that the metallic shield is not unlimited, and eventually enemies will blast through that shield and begin attacking your turret and camera directly, depleting their hit points. Hopping back and forth between different scenes based on the amount of hit points your turret has, the quality of the metallic shield, and your own proficiency in dealing with enemies at those scenes is pretty much a requirement, and because of the amount of scene switching and turret management you have to do, the game is a great deal more interactive than the majority of FMV-styled shooting gallery titles, which serves to keep you engaged in the action on the screen. Unfortunately, because most of the scenes and enemies in the game are randomly assigned and sequenced, there can be some times where you are literally juggling 4 scenes with enemies spawning in, each one at the same time. And while having to deal with more than 2 concurrent enemy shooting scenes is rare, it can happen, which is basically the game's way of telling you it's time to take a break, because I can almost guarantee you will not survive that set of encounters. The good news is that if a turret is damaged and incapacitated, it can be fixed and returned to operation, though the metal grating will not be restored if it happens to have been destroyed already. You can only have a total of 2 cameras repaired before you get a game over, so it's not like you have unlimited lives at your disposal. But I can say, based on experience, that any amount of help is definitely appreciated. One item to note though, is that if the turret in the 4th location is destroyed, which corresponds to the location outside the hotel room that you're using as your base of operations, you will die immediately and the game will end, with no repair being possible. Because of that, you will almost always want to prioritize protecting that turret whenever there are 2 or more turrets taking damage at the same time. Otherwise, you simply lose the game. Assuming you manage to make your way through a given level, or round as the game calls them, all cameras will be fully fixed, including the metal grating, and you will have your camera repair allotment replenished to full. The game has 4 rounds, and each one is progressively more challenging than the last, with the first round being a nice introduction to the game, the second being a pseudo on-foot segment that may or may not spell the end of your playthrough depending on your performance in round 1, and the third and fourth rounds being endless assaults of enemy forces that will make you want to pull your hair out in frustration. And actually, it's probably a good idea to talk through each of those rounds briefly, as my own opinion of the game ended up shifting dramatically from one round to the next. Round 1 is an incredible introduction to the game, with each individual scene introduced to you one at a time, accompanied by a cutscene featuring one of 4 protagonists that you'll need to keep alive if you want to successfully beat the game. As round 1 plays out, you'll experience a mix of shooting gallery segments and cutscenes, some of which will involve a small vignette playing out before someone reveals themselves to be an alien, whom you will have to shoot, otherwise they'll abduct another nearby character and live to fight another day. These vignettes mostly just add flavor to the overall experience of playing the game, though each of the 4 main scenes will have one critical vignette that you need to watch and interact with if you hope to continue playing the game. Similar to Night Trap, there will be a set of cutscenes you need to watch that will present you with a piece of a code, 4 different pieces in total, which will require you to not only find the right scene and vignette, but will also require you to save one of the 4 protagonists I mentioned a minute ago. If you find the scene and save your companion, he or she will walk over to the corpse of the alien you just shot and retrieve one piece of a code. If you don't find the vignette, or you fail to rescue your companion, then whether you can progress further in the game will come down to your guessing ability and a whole heaping portion of luck. Because after round 1, you enter round 2, which is an on-foot segment where you'll have a direct video feed from a helmet-mounted camera, which of course also has guns on it, as one of your companions explores one of 3 different locations in search of an alien bunker. If you pick the right location, you'll come upon a bunch of aliens to defeat, after which you'll come to a terminal that will require you to enter the 4 pieces of the code you hopefully picked up during round 1. If you got all 4 pieces, it'll be smooth sailing, as you'll simply enter the code, a cutscene will play, and you'll be whisked off to disc 2 to begin round 3. If you didn't get all 4 pieces though, which was the situation I faced, then you'll have to guess the pieces of code you didn't gather. When I reached this section, I had only found 2 of the 4 required vignettes, which meant I had to guess on the other 2, each of which could be one of 3 numbers, 0, 1, or 2. With crossed fingers, I approached the terminal and randomly guessed the missing numbers, hoping that I got them right, otherwise I'd have to restart the whole game. I entered the numbers, clicked OK, and I guessed them right! Holy cow, talk about a tense situation. If I hadn't guessed them right, the game would have ended in a fiery death right there, and I know that there is little chance that I'd be able to replicate that exact feat of luck in the future, so I simply counted my lucky stars and proceeded with the game, swapping over to disc 2 to continue my journey. Now, I should mention that each round acts as a checkpoint of sorts, and at any point you can restart any round you previously reached, making it so that you don't have to start over from the beginning of the game unless you didn't find the code during round 1. I suppose given the fact that round 2 carries over progress from round 1, that you could potentially brute force the terminal code by simply trying each combination of missing code numbers and restarting round 2 if you get it wrong. But the amount of tedium you'd hit here will be dependent entirely on how many pieces of the code you actually found. From my perspective, it's probably better to just play the game the way its designers intended, rather than trying to guess the 4-digit combination, unless you get lucky like I did, which I admit was an unexpected but pleasant surprise. Rounds 1 and 2 represent the first disc of the game, and at this point in my playthrough, I was loving the experience. Seriously, the cutscenes were fun, the shooting was engaging, and the size of the hitboxes on each enemy, coupled with the amount of time each enemy telegraphed their position, made it so that even with using a controller for aiming, it still felt great. For some reason, Ground Zero Texas was designed to not take advantage of light guns of the time, which means that the only control mechanism available for use was the standard Genesis controller. And as we've talked about before, using a digital pad for aiming a virtual cursor on a screen to interact with a shooting game is not the preferred way to play these titles. Most other games falter when you're forced to use a game controller to aim and shoot in these games, but Ground Zero Texas had seemingly addressed the issue, making the act of aiming and shooting, even with a gamepad, a fun experience. And then I hit Round 3. Let me tell you about Round 3, which from a storyline perspective happens after the aliens have dropped their disguises and are now executing a full-on assault on the town. This is where the game begins to feel entirely different, devolving into an incredibly frustrating combination of random civilians popping up when you least want them to, coupled with much trickier enemy locations and speeds, and concurrent location attacks making the act of preventing damage an exercise in futility. Round 3 also requires an excessive number of enemies to be defeated before you can move on to Round 4, and if you're like me, you'll likely spend a good chunk of time simply trying to survive long enough to reach the next stage without accidentally shooting a civilian and having to restart the round all over again. This round is where the limitations of a control pad-driven shooting interface really become evident, as the game begins to throw enemies at you in sequence that may randomly be in entirely different parts of the screen, requiring you to drag your cursor over from one side to the next and shooting them before they shoot you, which, let me tell you, is sometimes close to impossible. Occasionally, you may make it in time, shoot the enemy, and still take damage to your turret, because defeating an enemy and taking damage are not mutually exclusive events. There will be other times where an enemy will pop up on the screen and shoot so quickly that you'd have no chance of shooting him unless your cursor was already sitting on the location where he just popped up, which rarely happens. Over time, you'll begin to realize the best spots to position your cursor to maximize your potential success. But because of the random nature of the shooting gallery segments and the frequent scene switching, you'll likely find this section unnecessarily tedious, time-consuming, and frustrating. Eventually, whether because of luck, skill, or more likely a combination of both, you'll make it to Round 4, which does away with the concurrent attacks of prior rounds, but instead presents a sequence of scenes that feature a relentless and continuous assault for you to survive. The good news here is that there are no civilians in this round, which means, if it moves, shoot it, which is a welcome change of pace from the more cautious gameplay of prior rounds. The bad news is that each scene is brutal, requiring you to defeat around 40 enemies in each location before you're allowed to move on to the next, which is surprisingly difficult given your control pad limitations and the randomness of each scene. By far, the first and fourth scenes are the most challenging, with the second scene being a relative cakewalk, and the third scene being perhaps the most balanced of the four. But regardless, getting through Round 4 is pretty tricky. And then, finally, you reach the last segment of the game, which requires you to repeatedly shoot the alien mothership to destroy it and end the alien invasion once and for all. This is super straightforward and easy, which after suffering through Rounds 3 and 4 was a welcome reprieve. And with that, you will have beaten the game and can, like me, reflect on the entirety of the experience, which was uneven to say the least. On one hand, the first 2 rounds are pretty darn awesome, and if the whole game kept those same design principles in play, Ground Zero Texas might have been one of the best FMV shooting games I had ever played. Rounds 3 and 4 derailed that, but the question is, how much of a derailer did those rounds end up being? We'll talk more about that and the more specific aspects of the game like the graphics and sound in just a little bit. But first, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based on reviews we may have read in magazines, word of mouth from family and friends, and what the box looked like in the store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So for Ground Zero Texas for the Sega CD, the back of the box says Ground Zero Texas. Over 110 minutes of interactive movie action at 4 camera locations, so you never play the same game twice. Includes incredible special effects and a large cast whose lead characters interact directly with player throughout the game. Directed by Dwight H. Little, known for the hit movies Marked for Death, Halloween 4, and Rapid Fire. The chopper kicks up dust as it sets down. Through the haze of dirt and grit, you make out El Cadron, a shabby little Texas border town. It looks quiet enough, but folks have been disappearing. And as a tactical expert, you soon discover it's crawling with aliens disguised as humans. Welcome to Ground Zero Texas. Armed with 4 battle cams outfitted with a particle beam that stuns the aliens, you can't kill them with traditional guns, and a rover cam used to search out the reticulan weapon stash, you're into a sci-fi Wild West gunfest. Once the aliens know you've discovered their arsenal, it's all-out war, and they come at you like robot stormtroopers. Lucky for you, every time you score a direct hit, their green goopy guts go flying. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, and I've got to say, this box mostly sells me on the game. I will say that all of the features that they talk about, like the 110 minutes of interactive movie action and the screenshots and everything that make it look like a cool FMV shooting gallery experience, absolutely sells me on the title. When it gets to the end, where they're kind of giving the description of the story and they talk about the green goopy guts going flying, that just feels, I don't know, maybe I'm just being a little harsh. Feels a little sophomoric to me. Kind of like, come on. I know it's supposed to be a little cheeky, a little B-movie-esque kind of thing, but they were maintaining a pretty good tone for the majority of the text on the back of the box until that point. That one I'd have been like, come on, I don't know. Just that part didn't do it for me. But in general, the back of the box for Ground Zero Texas, yeah, it does. It sells me on the game. I had played this game. I never owned the game, but I did play this game back when it originally came out. I had rented it from Blockbuster Video a couple times, but I never did ultimately purchase it. But looking at it today, I can safely say, yeah, my curiosity would have been piqued. I would have bought this one if I had really thought about it back then. Anyway, we're going to move on to talk about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Ground Zero Texas are surprisingly decent, with nicely sized full motion video sequences and higher quality graphics than Digital Pictures' earlier efforts. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that this might have been one of the better looking FMV titles for the Sega CD. That being said, this is still a Sega CD based FMV title, which means that if you look at it from a general perspective, there's still a ton of compression, lower resolution visuals, and fewer colors than what you'd need to have a truly impressive FMV kind of experience. I still don't think the game looks bad, it just looks like a higher quality Sega CD FMV title, with all of the caveats that such a categorization would imply. Outside of the general quality of the FMV itself, the game doesn't have much in terms of graphics to speak of, short of the user interface, which is pretty standard fare, and a couple of short cutscenes that use pre-recorded video coupled with rendered 3D special effects, which are fine for what they are. I have no real complaints here. The graphics are limited based on the platform the game exists on and the technology available at the time, which is no issue from my perspective. If you truly want to look at the visuals from a more modern perspective though, then sure, the game is pretty dated. But I actually enjoy pixelated FMV sequences, primarily because they remind me of the 90s FMV craze, a period of time that I absolutely loved. I recognize I'm a bit biased here, but regardless, the FMV here looks as good, if not better, than most other Sega CD FMV efforts, and I personally was pleasantly surprised with the visuals in the game. Moving on to the sound and music, this is an area where there really isn't a ton to talk about because the music in the game consists of a couple of cinematic background tracks that play during cutscenes, as well as a singular background track that plays during shooting gallery segments. From my perspective, the music here is simply okay. It serves its purpose, but can also become fairly repetitive, especially the more time you spend replaying rounds 3 and 4, which will allow you to hear very clearly how little music there is in the game, as you can tell exactly when the game splices the song together with itself to form a looped piece of music. Definitely a bit of a disappointment from my perspective. Sound effects, meanwhile, are actually pretty darn good, and I appreciated the sound of blaster fire, enemies exploding, and every other effect the game uses in various scenes that you'll play through. I don't think there's anything especially significant here, but when compared to the scarcity of the game's music, the sound effects stand out as a positive piece of the overall experience. Voiceovers and general audio quality for the video sequences are all exactly what you'd expect, with clean sounding audio and better than expected acting, which is a bit of a rarity for FMV titles around this time. Overall, the game's auditory environment was mostly okay, with a balance of things I enjoyed and things I found lackluster, making for a decidedly middle-of-the-road experience. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as a Special Forces operative who has been deployed to Texas in order to combat an alien menace that is slowly but surely taking over the small border town of El Cadron. Upon arriving, you learn that an alien species known as the Reticulans are infiltrating the human race by taking over human subjects and disguising themselves as those humans, creating a situation where anyone could conceivably be an alien imposter. You're tasked with manipulating several specialized gun turrets in the hopes of combating the never-ending alien forces, and over the course of the game, you'll progress from fighting aliens in human disguise to holding off a full alien army to hopefully destroying their mothership and eradicating the alien menace once and for all. You have to be quick though, as the government is ready to drop a tactical nuke on the city if order can't be restored. The fate of El Cadron, and potentially the rest of the human race, lies in your hands. Generally speaking, the story here worked for me, and I appreciated how different cutscenes would play out that would give you just a little bit of extra context as the game played on. These cutscenes, which were all full-motion video live-acted sequences, were fun to watch, and I was pleasantly surprised with the production quality of each scene. The story itself was pretty simple and straightforward, but it automatically gets a slight bump up in my book, simply because it was told via FMV, which you all know I love. Take the FMV piece out of the equation, and you still have a fine story for an on-rails shooting gallery kind of experience, and I really don't have much in the way of additional critique or complaint here. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a great deal about the general framework of the game and its controls, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to reiterate, though, is that the game is effectively two halves of the same whole, one of which, the first 2 rounds you work your way through, is awesome, while the second half, the final 2 rounds you encounter, are tedious, frustrating, and poorly designed given the limitations of the control mechanics required by the game. I don't recall a time in recent memory where a game nosedived so hard after it reached the halfway point, but I can safely say that Ground Zero Texas did just that. Whether it was the incredibly punishing civilian death limit that made failure an almost certainty, the ridiculous number of enemies you needed to defeat in the later rounds in order to progress through the story, the inaccuracy of using a control pad to aim and fire when enemies appear across the screen from one another, or the enemies that pop up and give you no chance to react before they fire on you. The final 2 rounds are painful to deal with, and mar what would have been an awesome FMV shooting game. From a general playability perspective, it certainly functions, and the first half is decidedly fun, even today. I just wish the whole game was as good as the first half. But the fact is, unfortunately, the final 2 rounds of the game really bring down what would have been a fun and engaging FMV shooting gallery title, and ultimately, that experience is what I will remember most about the game. This is one of those situations where the bad outweighs the good, and despite the fun that I had when I started playing the game, the back half was so frustrating and tedious that it overshadowed any goodness that came before it. At the end of the day, it can still be a fun game to play around with, but its faults shine through more than its strengths. So overall, what is our verdict on Ground Zero Texas? Well, Ground Zero Texas had a ton of potential, and it pains me to have experienced how much it fell off a cliff in the second half of the game. I thought, for a brief moment, that this might potentially approach Pantheon territory. Yes, I said Pantheon territory for an FMV shooting game. That's how much fun I was having in the first 2 rounds. Then I hit round 3, and I began to think, okay, this is definitely not Pantheon worthy, but maybe it can hold on to become a golden oldie. Only then I hit round 4, and I recognized that the game had fallen precipitously far, so much so that Ground Zero Texas has just become the newest addition to our list of mediocre mentions. There is some goodness here, and despite the game's second half, the core experience of playing the game can still be fun in pieces. But the game's quality is so inconsistent, especially as it relates to how frustrating it can be to actually attempt to beat the game, that I can't in good conscience recommend this one to the broad game-playing population. It's not the worst game ever, and it's certainly not as bad as some FMV haters would make you believe, but it also isn't nearly as good as it could have been, which is why, for me, Ground Zero Texas deserves its spot as our newest mediocre mention.
They got Reese, but we're gonna pay them back. Look at this! It's their laser cannon. This baby can take out anything that gets in its way. The aliens are retreating, but Sat Recon's got a fix on where they're headed. Seems like they've got a mothership out by the reservoir. We've only got a few minutes left, then HQ is bringing in the tactical nuke. When we get there, don't worry about me, just take the shot.
That was our episode on Ground Zero Texas. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be our next Sounds of the Classics episode. This one is going to be focused on MMORPGs, massively multiplayer online role-playing games, Volume 1. So feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond memories of some tracks from MMORPGs. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Sounds of the Classics MMORPGs. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.